Hello again. So welcome to Lam Rim, and this session we're starting on chapter 17. Last week we covered not negating enough, so this is where we're wanting to recognize we need to be very clear about what it is we're trying to eliminate. And this week Rinpoche wants to talk about our position, or if you like, the position of the Margin Mark of the Middle Way School as to what the object of negation is and how we recognize it. So within that, I think we also talked about how not only is it important not to intellectualize, but we've got to be able to reflect upon the meaning of this using words that we're more familiar with, rather than those words that we find in the translation, or which I've been using quite a bit, that we might not be so familiar with, such as intrinsic nature or intrinsic or inherent existence and so on. So even object of negation, what does that mean? And I think it's really important for us to establish that. But before we start, let's try to set our motivation, recognize that we have chosen to tread the path, to tread the spiritual path. And within that, we recognize that we are just one with the whole universe of others who are also suffering like we suffer, who are also interested or willing or wanting to be liberated from suffering, just like ourselves. Therefore, for us to accept and acknowledge a responsibility towards all beings with a loving kindness that arises from us, or first of all cultivated and then becomes quite natural to us, to and to take on the burden of responsibility through our practice to become a Buddha, and thereby spontaneously and continuously benefit all beings. So within that, we're doing we're following the 6 perfections, and of the 6 perfections, it is the last that we're currently studying. So this is completely relevant to our practice and also to our enlightenment. So giving an example again of words that we use and words that we use less. Sometimes even the combination of words are important for us to relate to. So when we're talking about negation, or object of negation, negation here has sort of 2 meanings. It means one, to diminish or to reduce or to nullify or to negate in terms of undermine or remove as being powerful. So this sort of meaning is essentially says, something that involves work, and likewise there's also something that just means to demonstrate as false, show that it is false, which is slightly different. But both of them in terms as undermining or destroying something which is currently present. So this sort of idea is important for us to recognize. However, when we're doing one which is to show that it's false, it is not as that we're destroying something which is present. What we're doing is to recognize that something is absent. So I think these are probably the 2 things, if anything, we could use as takeaways, is this idea of objects of negation which require the destruction of the object, and objects of negation which require demonstrating the object is not present. Yeah, so these 2 are both being used in the context here. Again, the word essence. Essence is important because it's often used to mean sort of the heart of something, the essential truth, or the essence. And like essential oil is that captures the smell of a plant, a specific smell or flavor of a plant. So if we have an idea that there's an essence to the mug, my blue mug here has an essence to it, which makes it what it is, the essence which is the thing that itself, there is the essence of the mug here that is what makes it a mug. This is something that within this school is non-existent, it's not present. And likewise, we can often, if we're having conversations with people who are following spiritual paths, also they might say things like, I'm working on discovering my true self. So this true self, this idea of a true self that I've got to discover, is something which is negated by Mahayana Buddhism. There is no true self available to us. So, in fact, quite the opposite. The idea of this looking for my true self, or trying to grasp at, or trying to find and bring into existence, or trying to recognize who I am, is itself a problem. So we have to be careful, because, of course, this is Buddhist. This is a Buddhist idea, and while a lot of Lamrim is inclusive, this is very specifically Buddhist, and therefore, when we're discussing this with other people, we don't want to upset them. So it's best really only to talk about this sort of thing with people who are practicing the Buddhist path. And even within Buddhism, to be honest, there are people who are sort of still trying to find or believing in some sort of true self. So it's best for us to be quite careful about how we use our language here. And again, if you're struggling with anything that I say in these sessions, then all I ask is for you to think on your side. Right? Maybe Ben's wrong. I need to find out for myself. So this is not like I is grasping, but I must use. I must actually find my own path in these things. We are responsible for our own minds. So if we think about our own mind for a moment and look within, we sort of, first of all, normally think of our mind as being a single thing or a single entity, and we normally or often consider ourselves to be the mind, or something within the mind, or somewhere within the mind. If we examine our minds, we can recognize that actually there's a whole sort of forest of threads of thoughts that are all sort of slowly pinging up gradually, and most of them we ignore, we don't even see them. But the ones that we give attention to sort of become bright to us, or we become aware of them because our attention is there. But if we look carefully, we can see sort of other ones on the periphery, sort of making themselves available, as we're saying, yeah, or over here. Or we might have a sense, like a backache, or hunger or thirst, and they're like, oh, you're hungry, oh, I'm thirsty, oh, I need to pee, so, oh, I'm cold. All of these things can happen, and each is a sort of like its own thread. Or when we're sort of thinking about something, this corresponding memory or some sort of other stimulus arises, and this creates a cluster, or maybe one or two other threads of thought for us to follow. And so it's like, oh yes, and then we get carried away on this long journey of various different threads of the thought that keep us busy for the most of our lives. So one of the aspects of this is to say that we have this thing to do with there's like these forest of thoughts that are a bit like, well, what we can see is the canopy. We can't really see where they arise from, because when our mind is currently focusing on what is currently in its attention, then the others are arising through this sort of canopy of other competing thoughts. So they seem to appear suddenly, but in fact, we look more closely, we realize that they're stemming from various different related or unrelated aspects. So this point about this, the forest of the mind, the forest of the thoughts, is to recognize that a mind is not a singular thing. It's quite a complicated thing. There's all these different aspects to it, all the different thoughts, the emotional impact that these thoughts give to us, or some thoughts give to us, the attention and the intention making, the way in which the thoughts are managed or processed, and how they appear to us, the ground of the thoughts, and so on. So all of these things, in a sense, are separate. Yeah, they're different aspects of, if you like, the mind. So some of these threads of thought, we never really even notice them. They come and go at an unconscious level. We might have a pain in our shoulder, we don't notice it. It never gets big enough for us to notice because we're focused on something, and it fades off, and we never even noticed it there at all. But it was always there as a potential. So when we find that, when we get comfortable, we really become comfortable, then or our mind becomes relaxed from meditating, then we begin to notice other things, more subtle things appearing this way. So why we're talking about this essentially is because I wanted to really mention the idea of how we see ourselves, and we sort of imagine, okay, well, maybe I'm within the mind. But if I'm within the mind, then I'm one thing, right? I'm me. I'm one thing. I'm central here. Then which of these thoughts, or which type of which part of the mind is it that's the me? So very quickly we see, well, there's not much to the attention, there's not much to a single thought which comes and goes all the time, and they're all different. They're concurrent. It's not as if there's a single thread of thought at all. There's many of them. And then all of these themselves are differently grounded from different stimuluses and around in different places. So there's like this huge, great big network of various different things going on. And we can't say that, well, this specific bit is me. On the other hand, we can't say the forest, the whole mind itself is me. So you might say, well, this is something I personally struggle with, or used to struggle with, which is the idea that the aggregate, the group of everything involved in the mind is somehow me, seems to make sense, except when we recognize that the only way in which something can be identified as an aggregate is when it's superimposed upon by a subject. So from our side, so from and this is not very clear, from the labeling side. So we can label a group, we can create a group using our thought. We can say, oh yeah, this group here is a thing, right? But that is a superimposition upon the collection. The collection itself, the various different parts that make up the mind, none of them, they are all there. There are the thoughts, there are the bits and pieces that make it up. There is the attention, they're present, but none of them is the me. Therefore, we can recognize that the me, in one sense, the mind is merely a word we use to group those together, but we won't find the mind within them. And because we don't find the mind with them, we establish that it's just merely a label that we add on. Now, we might perceive the label in one sense or another, but we recognize it's merely a label for the collection. It doesn't actually have any meaning. Whereas any objective, it doesn't exist as a part of that group. It is a grouping. And likewise, the me, if we say, well, the me is the mind, then we have the same problem, which is to say the me is merely a grouping. It's not actually the group. It's just, it's the group, it's the way in which we group it. And therefore, it belongs to the language or the perception of the mind rather than the mind itself. So when we recognize that it belongs to the collection, the collective, the collectioning, if you like, the grouping of the various different aspects, then we see that, in fact, the self is not present in that group. It's not in the group. It's the group is of it, if we want, but then that means it's separate from it. And being separate from it means it's not within. Therefore, we can establish the self is not in the mind. So we can do this again and again with various different objects, and we'll find out in the end that it only exists in terms of a grouping, if you like, or a way of labeling things. But we don't see ourselves as labels. We see ourselves as entities. We see ourselves as something that really is. And when we do that, we sort of feel that there's a true self here. There is a real person here. There is a real Ben sitting here getting irate. So that sort of thing is like the way in which we perceive ourselves is like, I am, I exist, I fear, I love. Those aspects of it, those are very much of me, I, not merely a label, some sort of intellectual labeling. So again, we can imagine also that when we're when we're practicing serenity, one of the very first things even when we begin training in meditation, we recognize we don't even have very much control over our thoughts. They just come and they go. And then the idea that we have to buy into this, I had this thought, so it's who I am, it's just going to lead us into all sorts of problems. But, we have all sorts of random things coming in and out of our mind. We don't need to take ownership of them just because they happen in our mind. We could look at them and say, okay, well, there's a really interesting thought. I wonder where that came from. Maybe it's a rather toxic thought. I don't feel that way anyway. And why am I thinking this? We could be upset with our thoughts, but to think because I thought it, that means I have to act it, or that's who I am, is of course going to lead us into all sorts of problems. So yeah, we need to work on containing our emotions. We need to work on containing our thoughts. We're working on trying to understand and to relate to the mind that we've got. That doesn't mean we need to let it dominate us. We can build a relationship with it, and that's sort of very relevant. And all of this, I'm not talking from a philosophical point of view. This isn't just words, the difference between words, oh, well, the me is just a word, the mind is just a word for this, and so on. We're not talking about it like some sort of, like the way in which we recognize a collection as being separate from the components of the collection isn't some sort of mathematical philosophy. It's the way we perceive things. It's actually how do we behave within our universe. And what we see is we keep on doing things like having these presumptions that impermanent things don't change, and that things themselves have an existence which they do not. So when we can begin to recognize that this is actually how we perceive things. Now, you see, it's not a philosophy. It's just a description of how we actually seem to interact with the world. And then what we're doing within that is to recognize what particular aspects are toxic for us, are causing us problems. So, this, what we're trying to do is to recognize this me that innately appears. It appears from birth and before birth as the center of the universe, right? Or the center of our universe, but initially it's the center of the universe. And we have this, what is it within us that compulsively reaches out to grab, right? Something that we want. We literally just find ourselves compulsively moving out to get something that we want to eat or feel or touch or own, almost without any, sort of strong thought about it, just compulsively do this. And the same me, which is like upset when our favorite toy is taken from us. Doesn't matter how old we are. That's how dare you take my, so this idea of being the center of the universe is like, how is it that somebody should impugn themselves upon the choices that I have in my universe? How is it my mother has died? I didn't allow for that to take place. This sort of aspect of fury that arises from grief, like somehow my universe has been destroyed, determination of what should be and what isn't, and what is or isn't, is being overridden, right? So this is the me that is our most compelling. The me is our most compelling imaginary friend, right? So we have imaginary friends, but like the most compelling one that we sort of spend so much of our lives sort of trying to look after and feeding and keeping happy is our the imaginary friend that we call me. So as I said, but when we're born, we place ourselves at the center of the universe. As we get older, we begin to learn that actually the universe and our universe is slightly different. But there's always still a little bit of this infantile mind of the universe. I am the center of the universe, right? And when we begin to examine it, we see it's just really one of many various potential collections of narratives and memories and experiences that I've chosen to arrange or particularly hang around in a specific light that normally puts a lot of favor on my side of what a great person I am, or or not always, but I look how well I've done things. So this sort of aspect of essentially self-worship, if you like, of showing, oh, what an amazing person is here, or the opposite, demonic sort of self-attention of like, what a horrible person. Oh, everything I do is wrong. So sort of negative self-attention, right? Same thing. The objects are the same. It's still all me, me, me. So it doesn't matter. And sometimes our moods change from one to the other, like this. So even with all this sort of huge amount of energy and effort put into considering who I am, what I am, what do I feel about this, who am I to that, how dare they say this about me, how dare they ignore me, all this sort of stuff primarily is linked into this sort of room full of mirrors. It's all completely this whole universe that is all I can see is me in it. And this sort of, essentially, we know comes certainly from a very, very, very small and young age. Pre-birth. So before we, but Rinpoche wants to really break down this object of negation. So there's what it is that we're negating. And he says, first of all, it's really important to recognize that, just as I was describing earlier on, negation has this twofold aspect to it. So one of them is those things which exist and which need to be nullified, and those things which don't exist, which we need to see that they don't exist. In other words, we need to recognize that there is no need for us to continue holding on to our superstitions with this particular things. So he cites Maitreya. And Maitreya's, this is an interesting selection because we're in the Insight chapter, which is almost entirely Madhyamaka, and Maitreya's text here is a Yogacarya text, it's a mind-only text. But this particular verse is shared with both the Madhyamaka and also the Yogacarya. So he says there are teachings on afflictive obscuration and on cognitive obscuration. And we hold that all obscurations are among these, and when they're gone, we are free. So what does he mean that what is an obscuration? That which prevents us from liberation. So that which is keeping us locked in the cycle of suffering. And then the afflictive obscuration are the afflictions, those which keep us in the state of suffering, and the cognitive obscurations are those which prevent us from being able to achieve omniscience, the full enlightenment of a Buddha. So essentially all obscurations are among these, because essentially they define obscurations based upon whether or not we're talking about the liberation from samsara or the achievement of Buddhahood. So both of these two, in terms of obscuration to our omniscience and obscurations to our liberation, both of these exist. They are things that we have in terms of problems that we need to solve, and they look like pride, and they look like grasping mind, and they look like anger, and they look like all the other aspects of non-virtuous actions and so on that we've talked about. The lower scope is the 10 non-virtuous actions, and then with the middle scope is the causes of suffering, and likewise the afflictions that keep us in samsara, following the 12 interdependent links. So he says it's clear that so while Rinpoche doesn't go into it specifically here, if we go back to previous sessions when we talked about tathata, there's this natural way in which things are, the natural mode of existence, which is this naturally naturally merely dependent arising, no intrinsic or no essence, no self-essence, no intrinsic nature. Everything naturally is like this because the intrinsic essence, the or this essential nature are fictions, they're fabrications. So naturally we're already in this sort of state of freedom from these obstacles of freedom from this sort of inherent existence, all these things, right? So although we're sort of naturally, spontaneously, we're resting in a state of tathata, this suchness, yeah, it doesn't make us a tathagata. We have to work on being a tathagata, a Buddha, yeah. So otherwise, so even though we are beyond, which is tathata, we are not yet gone beyond, even though we're naturally in that state, because we haven't trod the path. And we need to tread the path because those afflictions that we just mentioned, the obscurations that are afflictive and the obscurations which are cognitive, are legitimate things that we need to work out. They're the things we need to take from upstairs and get rid of them, take them, push them out onto the street and let the bin man take them away. So we need to work to do that work. So the first one is called the obstacles neutralized by the path, or negated by the path. And they are, as I said, these are the ones which keep us bound to samsara. Obscurations because they keep us confused. They're toxic because they cause sufferings. And they're called afflictions because we are afflicted by them. They're like we're punishing ourselves. They continually keep us suffering and cause it. So they obscure in terms of how they keep us confused. They're obscure because they prevent us from seeing how our current suffering arose from prior suffering or prior afflictions, right? They obscure the consequence of what it is that we do. So we're not able to see clearly that if we do this, we will experience suffering in the future. And also obscure in terms of being able to recognize the path that releases us. And so, and fundamentally, if you look right at the base, is also the obscure in terms of the nature of how things are. So they're neutralized or they're negated by the path because it's through the practices of the path, generosity, patience, humility, training in ethics and concentration and insight that neutralize the cause effect and prevents the causes from arising in the future. And therefore that allows for us to achieve a liberation, freedom from samsara. This is the afflictive obscurations also turn even the most pleasant experiences, the most joyful moments, into afflictions, into suffering. And this is why a lot of people sort of say, when they hear about the Four Noble Truths, they say, well, you know, Buddhists, they always go on about suffering. I don't suffer. I've got a lovely life. I've got all of these things. And a Buddhist point of view is you have to understand that suffering means essentially that which we are still clinging on to. So if we're clinging on to, or we have a positive experience and we're like, oh, I want more of these, or I don't want these positive experiences to go, this is even of a subtle aspect of saying, oh, I love this, I really love this. This sort of aspect of it is a grasping at the present. And if we're grasping at the present, we're continuing to prop, to support and to sustain this great big sort of maelstrom, this sort of great big hurricane of self-grasping, self-centeredness, self-adoration, if you like. So there's a fictional self in the middle of this thing, but the huge, great big thirst that keeps us bound is far from being empty, far from being absent. So then the obstacles, the cognitive obstacles, or those which are negated through reason, are those which are cut at any latent predispositions. So it's far more subtle, and they tend also, they're like how initially where our perception is going to be our perceptions, our sense bases are still going to be seeing or cognizing some sort of essential existence. It's only through plasticity of the brain, through continual repeated understanding and meditation, that this begins to weaken, and then this is sort of like a cognitive obscuration in this sense. So Nagarjuna says, somebody in his Refutation of Objections, he explained something, and he's talking about these using reasoning, and he says, someone that thinks that an emanated woman is a woman, another emanation stops this from conception, and this is like that. So what does this? This is, for me, I mean, Nagarjuna is amazing, but he's quite condensed, so it can be quite hard to unpack. And what he's saying is essentially, if we recognize, if we're captivated by a woman because some trickster, whatever, a hypnotist or a magician is creating the illusion of a woman there, we're like, wow, beautiful. I guess you could also say it's like a film. Yeah, so if we're watching a film and there's this actress who's just appearing to be this most amazing person, it's like, wow, isn't she just gorgeous? She isn't an actress. It's all completely fabricated. So we see this film star and we're like, wow, that's just, I could fall in love with her, and so on. But we can also have a film. We can make a film and have somebody on that film saying, you know, these are all actresses. This is all completely fabricated. It's not as if these fantasy women from these fantasy scripts exist. They're completely made up. So even though it's a film telling us one and pointing out the truth of the other, it doesn't matter that it's a film. We can still use the same sort of narrative, the same lack of truth, to be able to point out the absence of the basis of our fantasy in the former. So when we recognize that it's like only is a narrative, it only is a script, it only is an actress who's, farts and has smelly breath and all the other problems that everybody else has, but creating this sort of fantasy illusion that we sort of rather captivated by, then it's like, okay, well, maybe it loses its allure. Well, okay, this is just a film, right? So he's saying it's like this. I don't need to have some fundamental truth. I don't need to be able to stand on a fundamental ground in order to point out that woman is merely an illusion. It's merely a film, right? I could also be coming from the point of view of just another film. I could also be an emanation telling you that, and that essentially it can be just as informative as talking to somebody. We don't need to stand on a solid ground in order to point out the fabrication. And Rinpoche uses this point to demonstrate that Nagarjuna himself uses objects of negations in two ways. One of them is in terms of what is, in terms of the delusion that keeps us bound or captivated, and the other one is what is not, which is the essential self, or the true self, or the intrinsic nature. So this is what is not. So Rinpoche is saying, look, we've got to be recognized that these two are separate. So we have the existing obstacles that do exist to our path, and these are the two types that we mentioned: those which are afflictive and those which are cognitive. And those we need to remove. They're the ones we need to work to remove. And then there's the non-existing objects of these, which are the objects of these misconceptions. They're the things that appear because of our misconceptions. And these we can negate, we can just show are not present. And we do that through reasoning also. So in terms of our practice into insight, it's the development of wisdom empowers us to be free. So it's when we understand, we become free, and we can become free of suffering and its causes specifically. So it's this last one, the non-existent fabrication, this true self, or this essential nature, or this intrinsic nature, and so on, or this specific thing which is non-existent, this fabrication, which is the main object of negation in insight. And it's this way that we may negate through reason. So we're using reasoning to destroy our misconception. He says, how is it? We can ask. He doesn't actually ask. He says, he answers the unspoken question of saying, by far the easiest way to stop a mistaken apprehension is to point out that what we are seeing is not as it appears. So when we recognize that what seems to be there isn't actually there at all, then that helps us to re-gauge our presumption or our misperception. So, for instance, we might see a hose pipe in the garden, and think that it's a poisonous snake, and as a child, we're looking after a child, and the child's in the garden, and we say, keep away from the snake quickly, and the child might laugh at us, saying it's only a hose pipe, right? But we're like, we're not going to believe them because, like, just a young child. What do they know? This is a real snake. This snakes can hurt them. Quickly, stop being foolish. Just get out of the way quickly, right? So then, even though the child's telling us that, look, you're mistaken, there's a part of us, sort of our pride, our arrogance, our fear, likewise preventing us from listening. We've got to deal with the emergency right now, which is this snake. And we're like this. But let's say the child now picks up the snake, and then sprays us with water with it, right? So at that moment, we realize that in fact it isn't a snake, it's a hose pipe. Because snakes aren't very good at being used for spraying water, and hose pipes are. And like, oh yeah, okay, it's a hose pipe. So we relax a little bit. We feel a little bit foolish because we're like, shown up by the child, and then more often than not, we're going to get cross with the child for spraying us with water as a mechanism both of trying to adjust our fear and also as like regain a little bit of sort of authority. So this thing of essentially is going to be where we are recognizing, shown by a child, that in fact this hose pipe is a snake, is not a snake. Yeah. So he says, is like, how is it that like Nagarjuna spray us with the water of the hose pipe and that isn't a snake? Is recognizing through reasoning, for instance, how causality, dependent arising, doesn't allow for the fictional singular object that we superimpose, that we perceive. Not just words, perceive. We perceive it, right? So just like the snake that we superimposed upon the hose pipe, the appearance of ignorance, the appearance that the ignorance presents us with is non-existent. The snake wasn't there, it never was. And likewise, this true self that we're searching for, never was either, in exactly the same sort of way, right? If it were to exist, if it were present, then it would be a complete mistake to call the mind that perceives it as ignorance, right? So we would have to look elsewhere for what ignorance meant in Buddhism. But there's no doubt that this is what Lord Buddha is talking about. And just like the fear that arises, this sort of aspect of terror or like sort of almost a frozen fear, when we see the snake that gets us to shout out to protect a child, we're affected by the ignorance. So even though there is no snake there, we still are affected by the perception of the snake. Likewise, just because even though there's no snake self there, we're affected by the perception of that self. So it's important for us to recognize that the projections that our ignorance makes are not correct, right? So if we want to reduce the consequences of this ignorant projection, we need to recognize that it is a projection completely. And this ignorance, the specific ignorance that projects or superimposes this self essence, this true self, right, is definitely a problem for us, because it force feeds this fictional, mistaken perception, this snake from all our other problems arise, this center of the universe that has been haunting us for us all through our entire memory. So we've got to break the back of this ignorance, and we do this through repeatedly and clearly demonstrating it's a mistake. First of all, it begins to loosen our grip on us as we even begin to, even having a doubt about it, and gradually, as we become more and more clear, we lose even a shadow of a doubt until it diminishes to nothing. And like it might be, for instance, with a hose pipe that we go back in the house, and days later we think, oh God, you know, I should go and do the weeding, but there are snakes in the garden, because there's still this the memory of being scared of the snake, right? So there's still, it can still affect our emotions, even though we were sprayed with the hose pipe. There might be still a little bit of effect to us. So again, what we need to do is to repeat to remember fully, and remember, it was just, come on, Ben, remember, it was just a hose pipe. There are no, so you've never seen a snake in the garden. It's just a hose pipe. And this then helps us to, remembering that we got wet, remembering that it's a hose pipe, then it's like, okay, well, let's look for go looking for snakes, find those snakes, find the hose pipe. It's like, okay, it begins to less and less have a hold on us this way. And again, the important thing is we're not destroying snakes. We're not going around killing snakes, right? It's not as if we're like when we develop insight, we have some sort of, we're developing a superpower which destroys the self, destroys our true self. And this is very important. It's like Rim says, it's like a hammer destroying a pot. It's not like that, but merely recognizing something that was never there in the first place. And because it was now we recognize that it's not there, then the imagination of it being there has no power on us, over us. So likewise with the snake that is actually a hose pipe, we are left no longer needing to fear its bite. It can't bite us, being a hose pipe. So in summary, when we develop a certain or sustain certain knowledge about that the self-essence or the self, the true self, doesn't exist and cannot exist, then then all of the mistaken perceptions that all these sort of fears and the superstitions that depend upon that, or the ways in which we live our life that depend upon the true self existing, cease to be. Because, you know, again, if it's not present, there's no point keeping up this sort of all of these fears and these hopes and these issues. So first of all, our mental apprehension, and then gradually our senses work through the same way. So when we're doing our analysis, we might first of all find it easier to recognize the lack of essence in the cup, right? But the more proper, the more powerful experience of understanding is when we apply the same reasoning, we understand the lack of true self on this huge, hungry blind spot in our minds, right? This complete blind spot. We just cannot get to grips with that idea at first. This is a black hole, or the center of a great big hurricane at the center of our universe, which governs our entire experience. So it's not as if it affects everything, all our perception, everything. We're still stuck in this hurricane of misconception. It's like a thirsting for existence, desperate clawing for being, right? Absolutely clawing, trying to establish self and re-establish self, which is generated by continually grasping onto something that we can never have, never had it, and can't possibly have, and we can't possibly be, not even for an instant. So this whole sense, when we begin to recognize it, is that often it's like, whoa, I can't go there, way too scary, right? Because we're not really recognized yet that we don't have the ability to destroy it. All we're doing is removing the way in which we perceive it. We're yet to recognize that it's not there. So again, and this is back to Rinpoche's like saying, while the term object of negation is used to mean those activities that we must purify or we must rid ourselves of, in order to be enlightened, including our ignorances, which are all existent, the same phrase is also used as the illusory tissue of lies that our mind continually projects onto our experiences, that provides us with this continual sort of self-attention that determines us as being the center of our universe and often the center of the universe. So while it might be clear by now that the fact that it does not exist and it cannot exist, it doesn't mean that we don't need to prove its non-existence. So there's a couple of sort of traditional objections made by people meditating on this, or say things like, because it doesn't exist, why bother disproving it, right? So we should by now have a clear understanding that just because it doesn't exist doesn't mean that we aren't affected by thinking it exists, and therefore it's absolutely relevant for us to make sure that we know it doesn't exist. And Rinpoche says, because we're not destroying something which by proving its non-existence, being able to establish the lack of a living elephant in this room, as not he doesn't say this, I do, right? Doesn't mean I've destroyed the elephant. There wasn't an elephant here in the first place. So the idea that somehow, oh, look, there's no elephant in the room, it's like, oh my goodness me, you're an elephant killer. Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. But the way in which we meditate on insight, it feels very, very much like there is an elephant in the room that we're going to be killing when we attack it, right? So this huge sort of like, oh, I don't want to go there. I don't want to change that much, So there's this sort of backlash in terms of our meditation on emptiness, which is like, oh, let's remain confused. It's way, way too dangerous to imagine that there isn't an elephant in the room. It's worthwhile experiencing this for yourself. Doing this meditation-wise is like we need to find out what that's like, because it's like, oh, God, maybe when I understand it, it's like, there's no self left. Whoa, and there's a like, oh, that's too scary. So who's being scared? Is our grasping mind. Our grasping mind is like such a strong hurricane. We think, enlightenment very easy. When we actually see, it's very easy for us to switch off our thoughts. A little bit of practice, and we can sit and develop a sort of a lack of sort of discursive thought after a few weeks or a few months of meditation. This is very, very easy to eliminate self-grasping in this sort of great big maelstrom or storm or hurricane of self-centeredness, self-attention. Very, very hard indeed. So this is what we're working on, is not just removing our thoughts, but removing our grasping mind. So again, and following on from this, Rinpoche says, Nagarjuna points out essentially that we can say, well, what use is it to establish the negation of what doesn't exist anyway? We talked about this. So, and it says, even without the words, all things lack self-essence. And Nagarjuna himself explains, saying, yeah, all things lack self-essence as a phrase doesn't cause things to lack self-essence. It's not as if I've got a magic spell, which when I say all things lack self-essence, the self-essence disappears. It's because there is none at all in the first place that we can use all things lack self-essence, like the child in the story, to say, look, no, it's just, it's not there. There's none there, never was. So it's this sort of like that. So there's another story you can use. Say, for instance, we've got three. Let's say there's three boys at home, and we come home from work, and we ask the middle boy where the older brother is, because he's really meant to be babysitting the other two, and the middle boy is like, I think he's upstairs doing his homework. Yeah, because he's loyal to the older brother, so he's like, oh, he's probably busy doing homework. The younger boy, who's loyal to the parents, right, says, no, 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 he isn't. He's gone to the pub. So this what the younger brother has said has completely disqualified what the older brother has said, and it's not as if what he said, such as he's gone to the pub, has made the older brother go to the pub. The older brother's gone to the pub, and all he's doing is showing. He's saying, no, he's gone to the pub. So this sort of aspect of recognizing, again, like the elephant, all of these things clearly these are used to show that all we're doing is establishing the way things are. We're not going to change you. So the point about this meditation is we can end up being terrified of doing insight meditation because it's going to change us. And we will remain the same, more or less the same. The only thing is we will be less confused about what's going on. And then gradually we'll be like, okay, well, I'm not going to waste my time with all this rubbish anymore, this sort of stuff. And it's just like, in my own time, I'll go. So yeah, it is important. When we decide to engage in meditation on emptiness, it's easy for us to become fearful, really fearful and avoidant. And when we meditate on, even with like this, why it's not normally used in terms of doing our serenity training, because serenity training, we're just trying to develop a calmness of mind. And with emptiness meditation, we've also got to work on sort of being brave and recognizing all the other aspects that are going to go on with this meditation. So because what we're doing is we're, in a sense, pointing out that what we cherish most doesn't exist. It feels this dread, this compulsive dread that feels that we're going to destroy what we cherish most. So even though these analogies and these stories, well, it's obvious there's no elephant in this room. So Ben's saying, oh, look, there's no elephant in this room, doesn't destroy the elephant. But when we look at this in terms of meditation, it's like, okay, I'm going to take away what we cherish most. And then it's like, I've got some washing up to do, or I've got something else to do. So we've got to be aware of specifically how this is. So why would we say that if we recognize it just like the elephant? We wouldn't. It's because we have this fear, that we're actually going to change, destroy something that we cherish, right? All we're going to be doing is shining a light onto the dark shadows, the bullying shadows of our mind that feed off what is only a fiction, right? What we're really doing is we're saying, I'm absolutely constrained and controlled by this self-centeredness, this being the center of the universe. It's only a fiction, but it gives me comfort. So that aspect of it to say, yeah, that comfort that you're getting is causing so much other trouble for you. Everything that we do is being affected and infected and corrupted by this self-centeredness. So the easiest way for us to lose our fear of all of these superstitions that we have about who we are and what's going on with us, the easiest way is to shine a light onto them until they no longer have any hold on us, not even a trace. So when we're looking at bullies, for instance, I'm changing slightly, but when we're looking at bullies hide in the shadows. They don't like to have the spotlight shone on them. They like to try and make sure that they're not noticed. So it's always surreptitious. It's always done without the spotlight shown. shine the light on a bully and they cease. They stop bullying. Likewise with our minds, we've got to use our torch of insight to look carefully, make sure the batteries don't run out, develop our meditation. So we're going to look carefully and see very clearly that things aren't as they appear. And as we see that, then the superstitions, these presuppositions, this whole thing begins to lose any hold over us, and there's not even a trace left. We are going to be destroying something. We are, because I'm not going to lie, we are going to be destroying something. But what we're not going to be destroying is ourselves. What we will be destroying is our ignorance. The ignorance that hangs on to this illusion. And it's the ignorance that's working to convince us that we have something that's going to be destroyed. So it's this completely fabricated ignorance that is sort of, if you like, working to prevent us from meditating. We won't change. We won't suddenly change. We won't suddenly lose our identity. Externally, most people wouldn't notice anything at all about us in terms of who we are. But we will be left feeling far, far more empowered, far, far more able to understand what's going on in our lives, far more free. We're going to possibly feel pretty ripped off. Because we've put all of this energy, all this work, all of this investment, huge amounts of investment into trying to find or trying to make or trying to shine or bring to light ourselves. And instead, we realize it was just a complete fabrication, a superstition. But we're also, as well as feeling like that we have been ripped off, we're also going to feel a sense of strength, that we're no longer going to be so easily exploited or duped or fleeced or misled. And this newfound understanding of just how furtive and insidious rather, and underhanded our ignorant mind is it provides us with the compassion that recognizes just how stuck we are in samsara. So when we recognize and can see clearly just how stuck we are, then it becomes insight-based compassion, and then it's easy for us to see just how compassion and insight are related to each other. Okay, so I only really covered a couple of pages today, but I think I better call it a day for this session. So we'll do more on various understandings of why we need to use the methodologies that we do to establish and to refute, to negate this ignorance. But hopefully this has still been a useful session. So let's dedicate any benefit from this to overthrowing ignorance completely from all beings, and sustaining and encouraging us to practice the path and recognize that of all the various activities available to us, Dharma practice is the one that holds greatest rewards. And then let's just finish with a sitting on, meditating merely on recognizing that self-grasping.